Hello music makers, welcome back. This is a quick follow-up video to my video called How to Not Master Your Tracks. One of the things I talked about in that video was the phenomena of using EQ cuts to remove sound strangely would actually make it measure louder on the meters. Now the point of that exercise was to show that audio doesn't always behave as you would expect. And I skipped over the technical explanation, promising I would link to a Dan Worrell video explaining the whole thing. Fast forward to many months later, I can't find that video. And judging by the fact that I'm still getting questions on it, it looks like you can't either. So, time to make my own. Here is why EQ cuts add level. First of all, I'd like to clear up a couple of misconceptions. Some of you may have left with the impression that this is a metering phenomena. In most of that video, I was saying, don't trust the meters after all. But in this particular case, the meters are telling the truth. The level is increasing. So it's not a metering thing. Also, due to the way I formatted that video, some of you may be thinking this is a digital phenomenon. Apologies if I gave that impression, but that is not the case. This happens in the analog domain too. So let's look at what's going on here. One of the things we take for granted in audio production is these analyzers. This type of analyzer is an FFT analyzer. FFT stands for Fast Fourier Transform. It's an ingenious algorithm which doesn't just benefit audio. This is how we get X-rays, satellite communication, video and image compression, to name just a few. Without going too in-depth, it's a way of taking a complex signal and breaking it down to its simplest component parts. In audio terms, essentially what we're looking at is how many sine waves a signal is made up of. Yes, you heard that right. Every sound can be broken down to a series of sine waves. And that is going to help us explain what's going on. Let's put that theory to the test, shall we? Instead of triggering a synth with a MIDI note every time, I'm just going to use M-oscillator here. I'm going to get M-oscillator to generate a sine wave first. I've just picked 100 Hz as an arbitrary pitch. It turns out 100 Hz isn't really a note that we use, it's just sharp of a C, but it keeps the maths nice and simple. But as you can see there on the analyzer, we have one spike at 100 Hz. Now, if we generate a sawtooth wave instead, saw waves are a pretty easy calculation in terms of a maths function. Anyway, you get the 100 Hz, that's our fundamental frequency, times that by 2, that gives you your first harmonic, which is an octave. Then it's 100 times 3, 300, that gives us our second harmonic at a fifth above the original pitch. And times 4, that gives us the octave above that, and times 5, and so on and so on. 500, 600, 700, you get the idea. That goes on forever until our frequency limit, what we call an infinite series in maths terms. So, in theory, if we keep stacking sine waves at 100, 200, 300, 400, and so on, we should be able to build our own sawtooth wave, right? It would take hundreds, but if we could find someone insane enough to...
2 hours later.
I actually did it. I am insane. 130 sine waves so far. I got bored at the 7th octave and stopped. That's about 12.8 kilohertz. But that is a series of sine waves all the way up to 12 kilohertz. Let's see if they make a saw wave. That looks like a saw wave to me. Mostly. It certainly sounds like one. I got a little bit lazy towards the end with the volume, so these ratios aren't perfect. But there we have a saw wave made from sine waves. I like how muting each channel sounds like filter cutoff as well. Now, why did I do this again? Oh yes, EQ. Okay, so we saw what happened on the oscilloscope when harmonics stack. They create new things, in other words. You see, we hear pitches going upwards, but on standard metering, we are seeing the total sum of all of that as one measurement. As you can see here, when we add two sine waves together at different frequencies, You're looking at the first two harmonics of that sawtooth here in pink and white. Hopefully you can see the resulting shape in green. That's a result of where the two meet positively. That's what we call constructive interference. Those get added together. And where they meet in opposite directions, that's what we call destructive interference. Those two get deducted from one another. And if any of you are thinking this sounds a lot like phase problems, you would be correct. All that advice you might have heard about checking your bass in mono is exactly this. Phase is referring to where the wave currently is in its cycle. And if you add two waves together that are on different phases of their positive and negative cycles, you will get interference. Now, the total output of these harmonics, the green wave in our case, the total sum of that is what we see on our meters when we get a number in decibels. Now, it turns out any change to this harmonic relationship will obviously change the resulting shape. And depending on where waves add up or cancel each other, that change in the final shape can mean that its total value may be worth more or less. Let me show you that in action. So I'm just going to use the first few harmonics of our wave here. About the first 7 or so, I think. Yep, 7. That's all we need. Now, pay attention to this number. This is our peak level from our meter here. And you'll see this shape changing as we go too. What I showed last time was a high-pass filter, so let's turn that on. And look, even though the frequency is nowhere near our fundamental, we've gained 1.5 decibels. As I bring the frequency closer to our fundamental, we get even more interference. As you can see, over 3 decibels gained now. And you can see on the oscilloscope here, some kind of constructive interference has added together and caused this big spike here. Keep an eye on that peak as I change the EQ frequency. So because we hear in frequencies, we hear when the low end is removed, we hear that as quieter. But as you can see, because of this interference pattern, there's an increase in total level. Let me show you this in another way. So what's going on there is the EQ is causing a phase shift in some of our harmonics. If you didn't know, that's how EQs work. It's not a byproduct of an EQ that the phase shifts. Equalizers achieve equalization by using phase shift. That's what's going on under the hood. Okay, so I've rendered each of our harmonics here as wave files. So we can see the individual sine waves. This is why I wanted individual control of the harmonics, because now I can shift the phase of each one manually. So if we take the first harmonic, the 100 Hz itself, if I shift this in time, that's the same as changing the wave's phase. You'll see the change in the output shape as before, those different interference patterns, including increases in level or decreases in level because of the changes in harmonic relationship. Like so. And you might have noticed this isn't even changing the sound. And if we look at the FFT, it's not changing that at all either. The levels of all these harmonics are still the same. So this is a good demonstration as to why we have to be careful what metering we use and how we interpret it, because this phase relationship change doesn't show up on the FFT spectrum, but it does show up on the oscilloscope and the level meters. And remember, 6 decibels is twice the volume, so 3 decibels that you can't actually hear is a lot, especially when you consider what comes after this sound. These differences could change the way a distortion operates, or a compressor or limiter, and if any of this is happening in your sub-range, then this kind of thing could be costing you a lot of headroom for clean-sounding loudness of your track overall. Now, almost as important, don't forget, if you learnt something, press some buttons, help me out, or you can buy me a coffee from the link in the description. And until next week, I'll see you in the comments. Bye-bye.